Good morning, church. I'm going to start us off with a silly question. And the question is this: did Adam and Eve have belly buttons? Now, you may chuckle at this, but I'm actually asking you that question. Did they have belly buttons? Now, you may be hearing this and you're thinking, what a waste of time to ask and think about such a silly question. Or perhaps you're a little bit more charitable towards me and you're saying something like, well, that's interesting. That's something good to pass the time. Or if you're a 10-year-old child, then that's a good question. But that has no real place in serious theological and spiritual discussions. Well, you may be right, but entertain me for just a minute and let's talk about it. First, I want to look at some relevant data. We're going to look at some biblical data when it comes to the first people, Adam and Eve, and then we're going to look at some scientific data when it comes to how belly buttons are formed with the rest of us, you and me. So, I'd like to say this first on the biblical data. There is no verse that says that they did or did not have belly buttons. So I don't think we're in a position to be dogmatic about it. However, there are some things that we do know about Adam and Eve from the Bible that may be helpful in relation to this question. Let's look at some of the relevant biblical data. Let's start in Genesis, a good place to start. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the livestock and all of the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, and over every living creature that moves along the ground." So we find that in the first chapter of Genesis. Moving on to the second chapter of Genesis, in which we find that the author zeroes in on the creation of Adam and Eve and focuses on them in the garden, we see this, Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." In Genesis chapter 2, verses 20, the second part of that verse, through verse 23, we read this: "But for Adam no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib that he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. And the man said, 'This is now bone from my bone and flesh from my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of me.'" So a few important points that I want us to think about biblically before we move on with the scientific data is that men and women, males and females, are created in the image of God. Next, we find that males and females are to bond in marriage and reproduce. They're to be fruitful and multiply. We see that Adam was not born of a woman, but was created from the dust of the ground, and that God breathed life into him. And Eve was not born of a woman either, but she was made from one of Adam's ribs. So that's some of the biblical data that I think is relevant. Now let's look at some scientific data, and this will focus in on the umbilical cord and where belly buttons come from. So the umbilical cord begins to form around 3 weeks after conception, and it's fully formed around 7 weeks. This cord is how the unborn child is nourished until he or she is born. Once the baby is born, the umbilical cord is cut, and after the stub of the cord dries out, it falls off, and what's left? A belly button. So everyone who's ever been born, including Jesus, has a belly button. But the question is not about everyone else. The question is about Adam and Eve. They did not gestate in a woman for 9 months. They were never attached to anyone via an umbilical cord. So how should we answer this question? I think we can reasonably answer it in 2 ways, and one of the answers is yes, and one of the answers is no. Let me start with the no. So no, Adam and Eve did not have belly buttons because belly buttons only come from the natural process of fetal development and birth. Adam and Eve did not have a mother, so they were never attached to another person through an umbilical cord. So it seems to follow that Adam and Eve did not have belly buttons. We're looking at the scientific data, we're looking at the biblical data, and we're kind of drawing that conclusion. Dr. Gary Parker, who wrote a short article for the Answer in Genesis website, says that Adam and Eve did not have belly buttons because your belly button is a sign that you were once attached to your mother. You depend on that lifeline for your nourishment from her body as you developed inside of her. But our first parents, Adam and Eve, didn't develop that way. I believe that God would not have planted on them a false indication that they had developed in a mother's womb. So we could say, no, they didn't have belly buttons. Dr. Gary Parker says, I don't think that they have belly buttons. But I think we could come to another conclusion as we reflect on this, and that is, yes, Adam and Eve had belly buttons. Why? Because belly buttons are part of the God-designed aesthetic look of what it means to be a human. That is, when you see a person and they have a belly button, it's because that's the way that God intended them to look. Now, why would I say this? Well, I think it depends a little bit on an intuition. That is, if you looked at a picture of a person and they did not have a belly button, you might look at that and say something seems off. Humans are supposed to have a button, that just like they have 2 ears or 2 eyes or 1 head. If you saw somebody with 3 ears, you would say that was off. Somebody with 1 eye, you would say, well, something's off. They're supposed to have 2. But when we look at a human, we expect for them to have a belly button. Now, it may be just because every time we've seen a person, they've had a belly button, but it could also be because we understand and we intuit what God meant for humans to be. And maybe that is a being with a belly button. Yes, I understand that our understanding of belly buttons now entails the birth process. But this may not have been the same process by which the first navels or belly buttons were formed. Every adult alive today was once a child. And before that, they were a baby. And before that, they were inside their mother's womb as an unborn baby. But just as the first 2 humans were adults and never experienced infancy and childhood, it may be that they simply had belly buttons because that's the way that God intended them to be. Just as Adam and Eve didn't grow up through the stages of life, they were simply created as adults. Perhaps they were simply created with belly buttons and didn't have to go through the process of being attached to an umbilical cord. It seems that reproduction as we understand it, minus the pain at childbirth, was a part of the original created order. The children of Adam and Eve had belly buttons through a natural and good physical process, just like they had arms and legs and every other body part which came through a natural and good physical process. So it seems that if Adam and Eve were like their children, then they would have had a belly button. So, I don't know how you're going to answer the question. You might say number 1 is clearly right. They did not have belly buttons. Or you could say number 2 seems to be right because I have that same intuition. Something is not right if a belly button is missing. Anyway, this question, the importance of this question. This question, does it make a big difference to our theology? Well, in and of itself, I would say not really. Are churches going to split over this issue? To this one, I'll say hopefully not, although there have been some splits over things that I would say are even less trivial than this. But ideally, no, churches are not splitting over this question. So then why in the world would I talk about it? God has made man. That's why. And we are called to search the scriptures to understand, number 1, who God is. But we should also search the scriptures to understand who we are. We are to ask, who is God? We're also to ask, who are we? And that entails both our spirit, our soul, and our body. I agree this is a silly question in and of itself, but it deals with a very serious topic. And I'm okay talking about something that's fun or silly in order to get us to think about something that is quite serious. What is this serious thing? I've already said it, but I'll say it again. It is, what has God made us to be? How has God created man to be? Even trivial things have some connection to serious matter. So I would ask, don't lose your desire to know things. Don't lose your curiosity. God has made us in his image, and we are created to know him, and we are created to explore his world and even explore ourselves whom he has made in his image. Again, it's a silly question. I get that. But I want us to think deeply even about silly things insofar as it deals with important things, like who is God and who is man. I'll be praying for you. Please pray for me, and Lord willing, I'll see you next week.